Okay, so we're just going to review what is a natural disaster, what is a disaster, and what is landscapes. We have some certain landscapes: mountains, countryside, and coast. So tornadoes. We have a tornado, disasters, hurricanes, earthquake, volcanic eruption, floods, landslides, avalanche, drought, wildfire, and tsunami. That's what we saw in the movies yesterday are mentioned what they are about. So what we need to do here is do a match. Where do these usually happen? For example, tornado. Does a tornado happen in a mountain, countryside, or coast? Where does it happen? Who can tell me to do the match? Okay, tornadoes usually happen in the countryside, especially in the United States. They have these plains, and it's because of the heat and the cold wind. When they get the they get you crash together, you would say, and they form these tornadoes. So it's in this they form that way in the but it's on a countryside. They have these long wide plains. They don't have any mountains around to stop the breeze or to lower its intensity. So that happens in those lands that are very, very flat and it's hot and then comes in cold air. So that clashes together and forms tornadoes. Hurricanes. Who can tell me where the hurricanes form? Does a hurricane form in a mountain? Where does it form? Hurricane. Okay, so hurricanes usually happen on the coast. Okay, the coastline comes in from the sea. They're usually formed over the seas, over the ocean. So hurricane comes from the coast. They come in through the coastline. Earthquake. Okay, earthquake can happen in um, any of these places. It can happen in the coast, it can happen open sea, countryside, or in a mountain. So earthquake, because it can be formed in can happen in any of them. This disaster can occur in any of these landscapes. Okay, so you have this one. This particular one can be replicated in a countryside or in the coast too, because it can form out of sea. So you have coastline cities that have suffered from an earthquake. In Panama, we have had earthquakes too. Maybe not so strong, but there have been Panama. Volcanic eruptions. Volcanoes usually are over the mountainside. So we would say they come from the mountains. Okay? Mountains, maybe a countryside that has all of a sudden mountain formation, but it has to have some form of to be able to occur. It's not over a coastline. Unless you have a volcano near a coastline, then it would have a volcanic eruption. It all depends where the formation is. Floods. Floods usually happen through, they come from the mountains when the water comes down the rivers and there's an overflow of rain. So it usually comes from the mountains towards the countryside too. So a flood usually comes from mountains because it's an overflow of water that comes in that extent. But it can also happen in other places. It can happen in the countryside if there's a dam that has a lot of water and that dam overloads or overflows because of the rivers that, if there's a lot of rain, happens too. So it can happen in much of these places. Landslides, this is getting too tricky here, but landslides also happen with, I just want to just put this one down. Landslides and floods. Landslides, land that slides down, that's what I mean landslides, come from the mountains. Okay, that is a landslide. You have all that rain that has happened, or so much water that's overflowed. So that is mud and it comes down through the mountains. So those are landslides. An avalanche. An avalanche can be due to, it usually happen on the mountainside too. That's another one that's mountain. Let me just, all I'm going to do is just move this one through, because if not, this is going to be like a spider web. So the avalanche can come from, comes usually from the mountains. You have snow, an avalanche of snow. So it's over the mountains and it rolls down. Okay, it doesn't occur in coast nor countryside. Now we have a disaster that is drought. Drought means no rain for a long time. So everything gets very, very dry. So there's no water. That can happen in many places. Usually in the mountainside, it does not occur because of the convection of the air and there's always water. So it's usually happens towards the countryside. Those that suffer with droughts usually is in the countryside, because in the coast we have water that comes in. It's more humid, so there's always water coming in, or somehow it always rains. But with, let's wait, let me see if I can just get this one out. Okay, so the countryside, we have drought. That happens. Everything very, very dry seasons. So we have that situation. Everything gets dry. So what happens when there's drought? Actually, for example, there's been a very dry season in California. California suffers from drought, and besides that, what happens? Everything is so dry and so hot that they have wildfires. Fire that is without control. So that can happen, but in any case, it happens usually in countryside. That doesn't happen in the coast. It can happen in a mountainside, up in mountains that for some reason there's a wildfires, but usually it's not so dry in the mountainside because of the rains. So usually this is more common to happen in countryside. And the last one we have here is a tsunami. Tsunami happens over the coast. Tsunami is formed after an earthquake that happens out in the ocean, undersea, deep, but or it can be nearby affected, but usually it happens undersea, and then it brings that gigantic waves that coming through the coastline. So these are more or less for you to understand under what landscapes we have these disasters. So here we have to answer question 5. And we have these words: disease, death, disease, global warming, homelessness, nuclear explosion, and war. We have to see, or we should consider, which, if these are causes of natural disaster, consequences, or both. So what would be your opinion? Death, is it a cause of natural disaster? Does it cause a natural disaster, death? Or is it a consequence of a natural disaster? Do you think natural disasters we saw were earthquake, tornadoes, droughts, tsunamis?
Consecuencia.
Okay, it would be a consequence, exactly. So let's just put this one in. So it would be a consequence. Okay, let's put it here. A moment. Okay, so it would be a consequence. Disease. What do you consider disease? Is it a cause of natural disaster, a consequence, or both? Disease. Disease, like for example, we have a disease now that is COVID. So is it a cause of natural disaster, or would be a consequence, or both? Can it cause a natural disaster? Can it cause a hurricane? It's not a cause, it's a consequence. It can be a consequence after this disease, when there's tsunami, there's a lot of corpse, people that have died, or a lot of things that are mixed and get spoiled. So there's a lot of disease that appear after a natural disaster. So in this case, it would be a consequence. Consequence. It's a consequence of a natural disaster. Remember the natural disasters we just saw? There are lots of them: hurricanes, tornadoes. The next one we have is global warming. Global warming. Is global warming a cause of natural disaster or a consequence? Or could it be
Cause.
it cause a natural, and could it be a consequence or not? Could global warming be a consequence of a natural disaster? No, because it's not, it doesn't come, it's not a global warming through natural disaster. It's a cause. You're right. So we'd have it as a cause. Okay, the next word we have there is homelessness. For those that are not familiar with the word, homelessness is people that have no home. You live in the street because for many reasons. So homelessness can happen, can be a cause of natural disaster or a consequence. Can homelessness cause natural disaster, or can it be a consequence? For example, if there's a flood or a landslide or an earthquake, what happens with the homes sometimes? We have that they disappear or they suffer. So people sometimes, or a tsunami, you can see the wave just covers the house and finishes it. So breaks it down. So people end up homeless, living in shelters. So those are consequences. That is a consequence of a natural disaster. Okay, the next one. We have nuclear explosion. Can a nuclear explosion be a cause of natural disaster? Or can it be a consequence?
Consequence.
A consequence, exactly. But a nuclear explosion could cause also a natural disaster. It could bring other things. It could affect us in other ways. It could bring an earthquake. It could bring floods. It could happen a tsunami. We don't know what the consequences. It's a, it's, it's a, it wouldn't be. It could be a consequence of something that happened, and it could cause also a natural disaster. So it could be both in this case. It could be both. There is one. That's right. Okay. And then we have war. War. Can war cause a natural disaster? We have wildfires. We have um, hurricanes. Would it cause any of those? War? Or could it be a consequence of a natural disaster?
Both, prof.
Both. It could be both because war can affect us in both ways. It could bring us a disaster. Let's say in a war, they explode a dam and there's floods. So it can work both ways. Okay, so that is to understand how, in what cases are natural disasters. These things here, death, disease, can cause or be consequences, or in other moments could be both. Okay, a cause or a consequence of natural disasters. So with that, we'll finish this chapter, this part, and tomorrow we will continue with the next one. It's a reading. Look up for the vocabulary because we're going to work with this vocabulary through the chapter, through this lesson.